Hello everyone, my name is Dav, and today I'm here to tell you that tier lists are clickbait. And of course, that means I'll be giving you my July 2019 tier list for Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer. So, before we dive too deep into things, let's just remind ourselves of why tier lists are dumb and bad. They are totally subjective, players have different opinions and will come to different conclusions. Ultimately, in Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer, especially in this patch, much more so than previous patches, as you guys will see, player skill is the defining factor. And the other reason why tier lists are dumb and bad is that they change all the time. Players will innovate, come up with new builds and strategies, new counters to various existing strategies, and just generally the meta develops and changes even over a given patch. There are also other variables like map, even starting winds of magic, and a multitude of other factors that go into a Total War Warhammer 2 match. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't draw too many conclusions from this. As ever, I encourage you guys to try it for yourself, or simply stay tuned to any of the excellent multiplayer channels to watch what actually happens. Like I said, the game is balanced overall, as you'll see in a moment. Next, let's get to how I make my tier list. There is a method to the madness, and I have made a spreadsheet that I'm not going to show you guys because I don't want your eyes to bleed, that lists each faction's matchups, good and bad. In that spreadsheet they get +1 for a good matchup, -1 for a bad matchup, and 0 for even. Each faction is assigned a score depending on their number of good and bad matchups, and then grouped into tiers according to their score. These rankings and matchups are based on hundreds of battles that I have played, personally casted, and watched on other people's channels, both competitive and casual, on every level of play, from the newest of the new all the way up to the highest levels of competitive tournament play. I'm a Total War veteran, played every single Total War from the original Shogun Total War when it was new, up until the present day, including 3 Kingdoms. As for Total War Warhammer multiplayer, I have literally hundreds of videos on my channel, because I am smart enough to realize that I don't know everything. I have also shared this list with a number of other high-level tournament players, including previous ever-chosen champion Felcon, other casters and community members as well. Just tried to generally discuss things outside myself, and while we did disagree on some minor points, generally the consensus was that this tier list was mostly accurate. Obviously, each person's probably going to have a little bit of difference of opinion here or there, but generally I got positive feedback with it. We're going to go ahead with it as it is. Before we get to the list itself, I want to quickly touch on the game balance. I tallied up a score for all 3 tier lists, starting with July 2018, December 2018, and now here in July 2019. This is the total number of tilted matchups, including good and bad matchups, so the lower number is better here. We can see in July 2018, 90 is not great, but it did go slightly up, which is bad, remember, in December 2018 as a direct result of the Vampire Coast. Fast forward to now, and we're down to 65, so you can see the game is much better balanced than it has been previously. Like I said, player skill is ultimately the determining factor in most matchups now. With that out of the way, let's get to the first tier of our tier list. Oh, sad Beastmen. Oh, you could almost say they're back of the pack. Or should I say, turd of the herd. Okay, I'll stop. Please don't click off the video. So the Beastmen, their biggest issue is that they don't really have any matchups that are truly favorable anymore. The meta has shifted a bit, and they do have a number of matchups which they struggle in, leading them to a -6 score. Yep, it's a bad time to be a Beastmen player. Honestly, they're really not that bad. They can handle in a number of different matchups, but they do struggle against all 3 of the undead factions. New Lizardmen tools also give them a lot of issues. They just struggle to deal with a lot of the big dinos. The main reason for this is because Minotaurs are garbage, by and large. The Regiment of Renown is very good. The Shielded Minotaurs are okay. The other two variants of Minotaurs are just terrible. They get torn apart super easily for how expensive they are, and they rarely will pay off. So hopefully Creative Assembly addresses that balance issue in the future. That honestly, just fixing Minotaurs alone would bring the Beastmen up considerably in my eyes. As for the Wood Elf matchup, honestly, Orion with the new Horn of the Wild Hunt and the Male Blade Lord with the Helm of Discord have changed that matchup considerably to where the Wood Elves can run over the Beastmen in a melee rush, and it's just, I mean, they can run over the Beastmen in a number of different ways, so it's just really not great for the Beastie Boys. In summary, CA, please fix Minotaurs. Beastmen, -6, too bad. Moving on to the D tier, I got nothing. That's right. The game, being as well balanced as it is, really only has one outlier in the Beastmen. Everything else is from C to S, and ultimately that means we are going to have quite a few in those tiers. So let's move on to C tier. Coming in at C tier, we've got the Dark Elves, Norska, Vampire Counts, and the High Elves. We'll start with the Filthy Druchii. Dark Elves are one of the most well-balanced factions in the game, with only 2 tilted matchups, no necessarily good matchups, but being a well-balanced faction, they don't have many bad matchups either. They do struggle a bit against their Wood Elf cousins, especially now that people have sort of developed into the new Orion, as well as, again, the Male Blade Lord, playing more rush and melee-centric builds, and of course their usual Wood Elf ranged shenanigans. As for Bretonnia, it's just heavy cavalry. All of the elf factions don't do great against massed heavy cavalry, and of course Bretonnia does that better than any other faction. Coming in at -2, Dark Elves looks bad at C tier, but honestly they are very well balanced and you really can't go wrong. Next up, we've got the Filthy Heathen Barbarians of Norska. Their good matchups are up against the Beastmen, purely because Fimir, the Beastmen just don't have a good way of dealing with Fimir. For a fun exercise, sit down, pull up the unit cards of Fimir and Minotaurs, and compare them 1-to-1. Like, just straight up, look at their stats, compare them 1-to-1, and you'll see what I'm talking about with Minotaurs. Fimir, on the other hand, are probably the best monstrous infantry in the game, with lots of utility abilities, excellent Regiment of Renown, anti-large variant, just overall very tanky monstrous infantry, so they definitely tilt that matchup in Norska's favor alone. As for their bad matchups, the Empire, with their easy access to fire damage, great combined arms doctrine, and AP missiles, the Skaven and Coast, with their long-range, heavy AP missiles, really punish Norska. The Dwarves, it's a little bit of an interesting one. I'll have to get back to you on that. Right now, I think it's pretty even. Previously, I would have said it was in Norska's favor, but the recent changes to gyrocopters have made that matchup pretty even specifically. Just wanted to mention that because a lot of people do think that Norska is pretty good against the Dwarves. Just be wary. The skies are alive with chopping blades, but now I'm getting off course. Let's get to the next one. The Vampire Counts. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Yes, indeed, all the way from S to C, which is quite a tumble, but still very well balanced overall, and I think much better balanced than before, in fact. Their good matchups are only against the Beastmen, where Blood Knights can just run over absolutely everything, and their bad matchups are against the Dwarfs, the Wood Elves, and Lizardmen, for similar issues. The Dwarves, their resilience, their high leadership, good melee defense, good armor, and excellent missile play really punishes the Vampire Counts. Wood Elves and Lizardmen both have really strong, heavily armored monsters, and healing that can just out-sustain, as well as other tools, especially good range tools. So yeah, the Vampire Counts, the summon nerf really hit them hard, I'm not gonna lie, as well as Invocation of the Heck nerf, but I still want to see some changes to Crumbling. For that, see some of my other previous videos videos featuring the vampire counts. That goes for all of the undead factions. I'm not really going to get into it here. Needless to say, I'm honestly pretty happy with where the vampire counts are at right now. For a faction that has way more lore choices than any other faction by far, I want to say they have like more than double lore choices than anyone else if you count lore of magic casters the same. They honestly should be right about in this position, in my opinion, but I'm probably a little bit biased against them. What do you guys think down in the comments below? Next up, last on C tier, the haughty High Elves. Their good matchups are against the Vampire Coast, where their excellent mid-range missile play and ability to sustain, and as well as having nice long-range counter-artillery options in their bolt throwers. As for their bad matchups, Chaos, they really just have a hard time against that super heavy rush, and Chaos in particular has some of the best tools, like Big Bird, Shaggoths and stuff, definitely can be tough. The Empire, again, Combined Arms Doctrine, the fact that they can bring really cost-effective low-tier troops, the High Elves are relatively weak to strength in numbers. The Empire can probably do that better than any other faction, while still maintaining, a good cav presence. Likewise, the Steam Tank, believe it or not, it can be a huge problem in this matchup. With Bretonnia, as I mentioned before, all of the Elves have a hard time against massed heavy cavalry, especially really good massed heavy cavalry, and of course, Bretonnia does that very, very well. Next up, we are moving on to the B tier. This is where things are starting to look good. We've got the two recent DLC recipients, the Skaven and Lizardmen, along with Bretonnia and the old Greenskins. So things are looking good here. First up for the Skaven. If you guys are curious, you can go have a look at my last tier list where the Skaven came out bottom of the barrel. Now they're sitting at a respectable -1 with good matchups against both Norska and Bretonnia, bad matchups against Chaos, Tomb Kings, and the Vampire Coast. So Norska, they just really have a hard time sustaining against a heavy missile attack, and of course the Skaven being able to bring lots of numbers to the field and just generally having good counterplay to the things that Norska can bring makes it really tough for the Northern Barbarians now. As for Bretonnia, of course, with Howling Warp Gale and heavy missile play, they can shut down your air units. They also have good anti-cav tools. It's an interesting one. I was a little bit torn as to whether to put this as a truly good matchup for Skaven, but just based on recent experience, I do play Bretonnia relatively frequently, and it definitely can be a tough matchup, especially against a very good opponent. As for their bad matchups, Chaos, primarily because of Big Bird only, it can be potentially pretty tough. A terror-causing, big monster that's extremely mobile and also very resistant to missiles, and has an excellent spell selection against the Skaven, is a lot to deal with for the old ratty boys. As for the other two, both are undead factions that can shoot back. Note how the vampire counts are not here, as with the Skaven you can really pull off some Death Stars now that are very tough for the counts to crack. As for the Coast and Kings, like I said, they can shoot back. Tomb Kings especially also have chariots. Vampire Coast has other OP units like Noctilus. It's just generally pretty good time for the Skaven. Coming in at -1, very respectable. Next up, we've got the Knights of the Lady. Bretonnia has 3 good and 3 bad matchups, coming in at an even Steven 0. They've got good matchups against all 3 of the elves, as I've mentioned with 2, and bad matchups against Skaven, Empire, and the Vampire Coast. So they're good matchups. As I've mentioned with 2, and I will mention with a 3rd, elves get run over by massed heavy cavalry, especially really good heavy cavalry that has magic damage, like Bretonnia. The recent buffs to Lewin, he got a little bit of a minor change to Beloved Son of Bretonnia that you wouldn't think would be super impactful, but believe it or not, it has won me games. Like, honestly, that ability alone. The fact that it's much more consistent now, I'm a big fan of, and it means that, like Chaos, for example, other matchups where you really want to take Lewin, and like, for example, Massed Hippogriffs, if Lewin ends up taking a bunch of damage, that's okay, it just buffs up your entire army, right? So So honestly, I think that was a really nice change. As for other changes, Alberic's gotten successive buffs to become a little bit more viable as well, and just generally things are looking good for Bretonnia. For their bad matchups, the Skaven, they just have such a heavy, as I said before, heavy anti-air and good anti-cav tools. The Empire just has like perfect counters for what Bretonnia can bring. The Faith buffs with Demigryph Knights hard counter Grail Knights, they have excellent missile options. A Steam Tank can be really hard for Bretonnia to deal with, as it does excellent against cavalry with its ranged attack, and will terrify and run over all of the peasants, which is exactly what everyone wants. As for the coast, they have just great anti-cav tools, great long-range armor-piercing missiles, so Bretonnia tends to struggle in that situation. That's it for Bretonnia, let's ride on. Next in B tier, the WOG is here. The Greenskins coming in strong with only one good and bad matchup each, giving them a balanced score of 0. They do well versus their grudge match, the Dwarfs, with good Vanguard, high attack, and cost-effective armor-piercing units. On the flip side, while Undead can be tough for the lads in a general sense, the Coast are the only ones who are really rough. They have excellent counter tools on nearly every battle phase with ranged units, magic, and more. And we've got one more on B tier here. That is the Lizardmen, also received a recent DLC. They are good against the Vampire Counts and the Beastmen, and bad against the Vampire Coast. Coast, again, that long-range, heavy AP missiles, just really tough for the Lizardmen to deal with. They can do it relatively well against some of the other factions like Skaven and Dwarfs, but Coast is definitely a tough time. As for the Counts and the Beastmen, both have a hard time taking down the really strong big dinos. That's why I put the Lizardmen where they are, respectable +1, and that will finish us off for B tier. Now on to A tier, Warriors of Chaos, the Proud Dawi, the Empire, and of course the Tomb Kings. So, Warriors of Chaos, they're good matchups against the High Elves and the Skaven, and they have no bad matchups. Also an incredibly well-balanced faction, very versatile, and they certainly are a lot of fun to play, in my opinion. Against the High Elves, we've discussed already. The Skaven, mostly this matchup is one-sided purely because of Big Bird, like I said. He can just absolutely menace the Skaven, so Warriors of Chaos coming in strong at a +2. Next on the list, we've got the Proud Empire. So, my personal favorite faction to play, just full disclosure, I am very much biased towards the Empire. However, they did take a tumble. They were S tier before, now they're only quote-unquote A tier. Got Norska, High Elves, and Bretonnia for their good matchups, and their bad matchups only against the Dwarves. So the Dwarves do really well at dealing with the Empire combined arms. They can outshoot the Empire, they can take down your heavy cavalry. The Empire doesn't have really the infantry or like the monsters to be able to disrupt the Dwarves, so it generally can be pretty tough. As for the good matchups, Norska we've talked about, High Elves we have talked about as Bretonnia. The combined arms strategy of the Empire still is powerful as it ever was, it's just that some other factions have had some changes, and the meta has developed a little bit around the Empire Rush style of play. Although I have to say, the Witch Hunter change, one of my favorite changes that has happened recently for the Empire, it makes the Witch Hunters much more interesting, in my opinion, and allows them to synergize very well with a number of other units. Moving on next to the Dwarves. We're here with the Proud Dawi, unleashing their powder. They are good against the Empire, Vampire Counts, and Norska, as discussed, and bad against the Greenskins. From here on out, it's going to start to go a little bit faster as we have discussed many of these matchups. Just touching on a couple of general changes for the Dwarves. The Gyrocopter change did help them out in a number of matchups, as I mentioned. The fact that Gyrocopters, and even the Gyro Bomber, has been seeing some very solid use recently, which is always nice to see. Personally, I have been enjoying playing the Dwarves dwarves with air-focused builds, or not necessarily air-focused builds, but with at least a bomber, maybe a few copters or something. It just gives you some kind of tactical flexibility and mobility to micro throughout the battle. Makes playing dwarves a little bit more interesting for me personally. Next up, we've got ye ol' Skelly boys in the Tomb Kings. They're good matchups as discussed against the Beastmen and Skaven, and again, no bad matchups, a very well-balanced faction overall. Tomb Kings are honestly really strong. You'll see them well represented in tournament play, but it's always uneven battle, certainly. Other factions do have the tools to deal with what they can bring, but at the same time, the Skelly boys are looking pretty good these days. And now we move on to the S tier, the Realm of the Gods. The final highest tier, which honestly is only +3, which is +1 better than the A tier. So like I said, take these rankings with a grain of salt, guys. All of these factions from C to S are all honestly relatively close, and for the most part, on any given day between most of them, you would see a very, very good fight. But without further ado, let's move on. The Hippie Tree Elves, as discussed, have good matchups against Dark Elves, Vampire Counts, Beastmen, and we haven't talked about the Coast yet, but Wood Elves, because they have, again, great mid-ranged missile play, they can deal with a lot of the monsters of the Vampire Coast relatively easily. Orion is a brutality to deal with in that matchup, just because he's super hard to kill with his Cloak of Isha. Wood Elves coming out on top with 4 good matchups and only 1 bad matchup in Bretonnia. They can get run over pretty hard by those heavy knights, although certainly it's not as bad as it used to be. I do think there's some things that you can do there, but still, it can be tough, so they've come in at a +3, looking good for the Hippie Tree people, honestly. I really like the changes they've done with Orion and the Mailed Blade Lord. The Helm of Discord and the Horn of the Wild Hunt makes them much more usable characters. The Wood Elves are very much more flexible now. They can definitely take much more powerful melee-centric builds, which personally is the way that I like to play them. We'll leave the Tree Folk and move on. Last but absolutely least, we've got the Filthy Vampire Coast. So their good matchups are against Norska, Greenskin, Skaven, Bretonnia, Beastmen, and the Lizardmen, and they have bad matchups against the High Elves, Wood Elves, and Dwarves. So you can see kind of the really good mid-range factions usually will outclass the Vampire Coast. Those are also factions with good leadership as well, High Elves, Wood Elves, and Dwarves. As for the matchups which are favorable for the Coast, I've already talked through all these, so no need to go overboard. The Vampire Coast has some of the more tilted matchups. I do think that they could use a few tweaks. It's tough to say. I need to dive into some more games and really deep dive and see what changes they would need to make to bring the Vampire Coast into balance, but it's much better than it used to be, certainly. When their patch came out, it was all the Wild West, but now things are looking relatively well balanced. And again, guys, this is only a +3, and A tier was +2, right? So the difference here is not massive. That is all for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this tier list. If you guys are new to the channel, be sure to check out. I have literally almost 1,000 battle replays at this point up on the channel. Be sure to check them out if you want some hot Total War Warhammer multiplayer action. If you think that I'm an idiot and want to disagree with me in the comments, feel free, go right ahead. I will gladly argue with you all day. Thank you very much once again. If you're not a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe. If you want daily Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer battles, like the video if you liked it, or if not, feel free to dislike. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.